One of the basic building blocks of any development project is going to be the financial aspect. And the way that usually comes into the conversation, you'll probably hear some of this jargon thrown around during your OAC meetings, your owner, architect, contractor meetings, or any other project meeting on the design side of any built environment project. You'll hear a lot of this jargon, but one of the things you'll first hear about is this concept of a pro forma. So what is a pro forma, and frankly, why does it matter to you if you're a consultant or a designer? That's what we're going to get into today. So, pro forma is really the way that a developer looks at the financial timeline of a project. They look at individual aspects of the finances over a period of time, right? So you can't have a pro forma that just talks about a point in time. A pro forma is always over duration. A typical duration is probably 10 years. And that's kind of the investment life cycle of the project. So in the pro forma, you're going to have some basic components. You're going to have some revenue side components, right? So what's the income? How is money moving into the project? And you're going to have some outflows, right? Some cost components of the pro forma. And inbound could be revenue from rent, could be funds that are invested in the project from different equity and debt sources. And then on the expense side, you have all sorts of things, right? There's construction costs, there's design costs, there's operating expenses once the project's up and running, and other fees and taxes and things. So what they're doing is taking all the inflows, subtracting out the outflows, and you wind up with the difference, which is the net. And in most pro formas, the key metric of the pro forma is what's called the net operating income, or NOI. And NOI is simply the operating revenues minus the operating expenses. So it doesn't include debt, it doesn't include a lot of other things. But the net operating income is a way for developers to compare one project against another, or compare different types of projects against one another, and how the NOI, or net operating income, looks over a duration of time. And so that is kind of the basics of what a pro forma is. Again, it's revenue minus expenses on the operating side. So construction costs aren't part of this. Capital expenditures aren't part of this. It's just operating income minus operating expenses, and get your net operating income. And again, since that's over a period of time, usually 10 years, you wind up with the pro forma. And so what do they do now? Well, now your developer has some decisions to make, and usually that involves taking all of that future cash, all of that future cash flow, and the cash flows can be positive or they can be negative, right? So you can have a negative cash flow if your expenses are more than your income. Your cash flow is negative. That usually happens at the beginning of the project when it's in lease up, or before it's stabilized. But once it's stabilized, it should be what's called positive cash flow, or cash flow positive, where the operating income is more than the operating expenses, so you have positive NOI. But you wind up with this series of cash flows, so year 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way through 10. And the next step is to bring those cash flows from the future back to the present. And that's done through what's called a discounted cash flow analysis, or DCF. And when you bring those future cash flows back to the present using what's called a discount rate, which is usually some combination of either a comparison of a risk-adjusted rate of return. So if you say, if I have a project that has, or if I have an investment that has no risk, something like the 10-year treasury is effectively no risk, this development project is going to be riskier, so the return has to be higher. So you've got what's called a spread over your 10-year treasury is now your required rate of return, or your risk-adjusted required rate of return. Because again, different projects have different risk profiles, different markets have different risk profiles. So you need to have a way to kind of compare those cash flows against one another. Because again, a positive cash flow in project A is not going to be worth the same as a positive cash flow in project B if the risks are different. So using the pro forma, you model out your cash flows, then you use your discount rate to bring those cash flows back to what they'd be worth today. And without getting into all the details, the way to think about that is if you invested $100 today in a project or in a stock that had a 10% rate of return, a year from now you'd have $110. So you're kind of doing that math in reverse. What would you have to invest today to get that future cash flow, right? And so using that discount rate, instead of the 10%, it could be 14% or 16% or 20%. You're taking those future cash flows and bringing them back to today which gives you the present value of all those future cash flows. And that should be positive. They can then make a decision on, is this a good project or a bad project, right? So you've got your future cash flows. You've figured out a way to adjust those cash flows for the risk and adjust them for time. You've brought them back to today by discounting them, right? Because $100 today gets you 110 in the future in our example. Well, what would you have to invest today to get that future cash flow? Again, you're reducing those values back to today. So the positive cash flows get smaller when they're brought back to today. The negative cash flows also get smaller. So it's not as negative in today's dollars as it is in future dollars. You bring those back, you add them all up, and you've got your present value. The net present value, or NPV, is something you might also hear, and that is the difference between the present value of the future cash flows and the investment made today, right? So if the present value of your future cash flows, based on your pro forma, based on your risk-adjusted rate of return, is 150, call it 150 million or $150. If it's 150 and your investment is 100, 150 minus 100 is a net present value of a positive 50. That would be deemed a go. That's a good investment. That's an investment you should make. If your net present value is positive, that's an investment you should make. If the future cash flow is less, if the present value of the future cash flow is less than the present day investment, then you would wind up with a negative net present value, and that would be a no-go. That's an investment you don't want to make. So why does all this matter to the design profession? When you're working with your development clients, it's important to speak in their language. It's important to tie your design choices and your recommendations to the project, your advice, to what ultimately moves the needle for the investment, which is the primary concern of the developer. So if you can speak in their language and understand, you don't need to know how to build a pro forma. You don't need to know how to set risk-adjusted rate of return. But if you can understand the basic concepts and understand that if you can create more value in the future, or you can create more value sooner in the future, that is a more positive present value. And again, given a set of costs today, the higher that you can create the higher present value you can create, the better investment, the more attractive investment the developer is going to see. So as a consultant working in the built environment space, it's really important for you to understand how your development clients are thinking about the project when it comes to cash flows, when it comes to time, and ultimately when it comes to risk. And if you can, again, move those levers in the appropriate way, you can result or make advice and advise your clients in a way to produce better projects, better design, and ultimately a better outcome for you and the projects that you're working on.